Chapter 21, Lucky Horse 1. Oh, Kang Seung raised a curious eyebrow. And what does my precious grandson want for his birthday? I smirked and leaned towards his ear and whispered, I want to go to your private horse club and see your ponies. Hearing my request, instantly Seung's face darkened. Now where did you learn about that? His grip on my shoulder tightened. He was like a startled tiger wondering whether it should pounce or not. A lot of people tell me things, even special secrets. You know how popular I am. I smiled up at him, looking him right in the eyes. For a while we silently faced off against each other. He was trying to figure me out and I was toying with him. Eventually, Kang Seung's frown cracked into a smile. Soon enough he began to chuckle as if he'd heard the funniest joke in the world. Of course you would know about my private horse club. I shouldn't be surprised. I should expect at least that from a little devil like you. He laughed. Then just as quickly as his laughter appeared, it instantly faded away. His mouth formed a thin line, and a calculative look appeared on his old face. Now what does a barely 2-year-old child want to do at my horse club? He asked. I batted my eyelashes up at him in response. Kang Seung's private horse club. It was a place that was briefly mentioned in the novel Overcoming Obstacles. In the story, after Song Jae's family had been murdered, he barely escaped from his burning home with his life. The hired killer still hot on his heels. He ran barefoot and bloody to the police station and he reported the event. However, when he went to the station bathroom, he overheard 2 officers talking. These cops were on Kang family's payroll, and he soon realized that not only were the police working with the killer, but that the whole thing was orchestrated by his classmate Kang Ho. After learning that Kang Ho was behind this, Song Jae was initially outraged, but he soon became cautious. He knew of the influence of the Kang Mung group, but he did not understand Kang Ho's position in the family. As far as Song Jae knew, Kang Ho had the resources and power to mobilize all kinds of people to chase him. He feared that he would be hunted down and killed if he stayed in South Korea any longer. So he decided to run, leave the country, and get his revenge later. After coming to that decision, Song Jae ran from the police station and found an old friend of his father's who was a retired gangster. That friend got Song Jae out of the country through a smuggling ring called Golden Hoof. Now, Golden Hoof was an underground black market organization. They had various branches which dealt with various crimes from smuggling weaponry, drugs, and people. In the novel, it was called the largest human trafficking ring in the world. Golden Hoof was untouchable because it was owned by the super-rich and elite. Not only were its connections vast, but so were its bloodied hands. It was another cog in society that kept crime afloat, made the poor poorer and the rich richer. In South Korea, the Kang family was the largest sponsor of Golden Hoof, and Kang Seung was known to be a close friend with the leader of the underground organization. Kang Seung's private horse club was actually a front for Golden Hoof's Korean branch. In the novel, Song Jae was smuggled out of the country through their private horse club, which he later found out to be a Golden Hoof branch that was owned by Kang Seung. Ironically, if the Kang Ho in the novel had been even the tiniest bit favored by his grandfather or the Kang family, he would have easily been able to use Golden Hoof's resources, and Song Jae would have never made it out of the country alive. But as you know, that wasn't the case. I smiled adoringly up at my granddad. What do you mean? I want to see your ponies, your races, and what you have on offer. Oh, and I would like to take my butler, Min Ho, with me so that he can also enjoy the experience. Kang Seung stared at me seriously for a minute, but then his bottom lip began to twitch and he burst into loud laughter. Oh, I really can't figure you out. No child acts the way you do. Are you a once-in-a-millennia child prodigy like the papers hail you to be, or did my son produce the Antichrist? Ha ha ha. He laughed for a few more minutes more before his eyes darkly twinkled at me. Why not? My father always said you can never start too young when it comes to learning about the world. I'll give that twisted little soul of yours something to feast on. Do you remember when I said I liked Kang Seung? Yeah, I like him. We were definitely the same type of animal, but he severely underestimated me. Compared to me, he was like a cub walking around and dabbling in some hunts. I was a well-versed monster prowling the fields. He wanted to give my soul something to feast on, but the horse club was a place only capable of whetting my appetite. No, the only reason I wanted to go was for Min Ho. This would be his push. 2 weeks later, the day came about. There were 5 of us in the car. Kang Sung's Korean-English secretary William Kim, Kang Sung's bodyguard Chul Soo, Kang Sung, Min Ho and myself. All Min Ho had been told was that Kang Sung was taking me to his horse club as a birthday surprise. Thinking that we were off to see actual ponies and animals, Min Ho was happily strapped in the back seat holding my hand while he danced a stuffed horse toy in my face. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him at that club. For a man so hung up on karma and justice, this place would break his little mind. But no worries, I would be there to offer him a hand and give him support. A wide smile appeared on my small face. I couldn't stop the chuckles from leaving my throat. The very anticipation of seeing Min Ho's face when he realized the truth made me tingle all over. It's like when you break in new shoes and they finally get comfortable enough for you to freely walk in them. I was about to break in Min Ho. Chapter 22. Lucky Horse 2. Seung's racing club was what you would expect it to be on the outside. There were large, luxurious fields, and between those fields were the racing tracks. Some were made from grass, others were dirt tracks or sand tracks. In pens near the tracks there were horses and their jockeys and several stables. When a pistol went off in the distance, a heated race would begin. Overlooking the fields and racing tracks was a large grandstand. It was easily the size of a football stadium. It had private rooms, VIP suites, and over 2,000 seats. Seated there was a large audience of luxuriously dressed ladies and gentlemen, all chatting away and making bets. Near the entrance of the grandstand in the betting ring were bookmakers who were processing and recording the games and the winnings for the day. It was noisy, filled with the sounds of cheering, chatter, and presenters shouting over tannoys. It seemed like a typical fancy racing house reminiscent of something you'd see at the Ascot. When we entered the grandstand, many of the staff at the entrance bowed deeply towards us. "Welcome, Sir Seung," they said in unison. One man in particular, with greying hair, who wore a tweed-striped suit and had a rather ordinary face, greeted Kang Sung personally. "It's a pleasure to see you here today, sir. Are you here for the races or for the usual entertainment?" "Sang-min," he greeted the man, "obviously the usual." Kang Sung then gestured towards me. "I'm sure you've heard about my grandson. I've brought him today to break him in early to the fun side of the world. Kang Ho, say hello to Sang-min. He runs this fine establishment on my behalf and on the behalf of the lovely Golden Hoof." I glanced at Sang-min, and I immediately noticed that look. The look of a fellow predator. You know how animals recognize members of their own species by instinct. I immediately recognized it when I saw Sang-min. In the core of his eyes was a hunger that required the blood of others to be satiated. I wondered how many people he had killed. It didn't seem like the number was small. He also seemed to recognize me for what I was, because he suddenly became more alert. His eyes seemed to widen, and a small smile appeared around his thin lips. His smile only grew bigger when I bowed my head deeply towards him. "Pleasure to meet you, Sang-min." He nodded his head approvingly at my polite greeting. "You have a very interesting grandson, Seung. A very interesting grandson indeed." When Kang Sung heard Sang-min say interesting twice, he instinctively put his arm between us and gave Sang-min a wary look. "Yes, he is interesting," he replied calmly. Sang-min laughed lightly, but his laughter didn't reach his cold eyes. "You must really like your grandson." He rested his hand on Kang Seung's raised arm. "Don't worry so much, I won't bite him." There seemed to be a silent standoff between the two of them for a moment. But then Kang Sung burst into raucous laughter. His laughter was so loud that he made a few heads turn towards us. "Well, then shall we leave?" Sang-min nodded. "Let's go." We came towards a VVIP elevator. It was elaborately made with intricate artwork carved into the metal and granite on its doors. Just the crystal button used to call the elevator seemed costly. Sang-min used his ID card, and the lift pinged, and the doors opened to a large space. The elevator was so big that it had a red velvet sofa inside and a butler at the corner who was serving drinks. "Any refreshments?" Sang-min asked. "I wouldn't mind a martini and perhaps some milk for the child." Immediately I was given a bottle of milk, and Kang Sung got a lovely martini. Every time I thought I got used to living with excessive wealth, I was always surprised by something. The elevator only had one stop, and that was you, which likely stood for underground. The elevator dropped for what felt like 8 minutes, and when the doors opened, we were in a whole different venue. There were projections on the ceiling that made it feel like the night sky was above us. The walls were carved from stone and rich black granite that was smooth and cool to the touch. Tall stone pillars surrounded the entrance, and on those stone pillars were hooves made of gold. I heard Min-ho softly gasp. As we walked beyond the entrance, the area opened up even further into a massive casino. People were betting and gambling large amounts of money. If the spectators upstairs had been richly dressed, then the people at this site were beyond that. Wealth oozed off the very fabric of their clothing. Most of the people here wore masks. It was obvious why. This place was the center of debauchery and illegal activity. "What are you in the mood for?" Sang Min asked. "Some gambling, fighting, or something a bit more intimate?" "Let's go for some fights. What matches are on today?" "We have the Blind Bulldog versus the Weasel Kid that's just about to start, and then some newbies. You're also free to submit any of your own new fighters today as well. I know Blind Bulldog. He's our reigning champion, but I've never heard of this Weasel Kid before. Who is he?" Kang Sung rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Oh, you haven't come by recently, so you likely haven't seen him. A few weeks ago, Lu Dong, the head of the Lu Group from China, came to Korea for business. He's still here. He brought this fighter Weasel Kid with him. He's young but frighteningly strong, and he's been winning every fight that he's been put in." "Every fight?" "Every fight." "Then I definitely have to see this." From the casino area, we went to a new hall. It was a huge stadium with hundreds of spectators, people in masks, cheering, shouting and screaming loudly. On the stage at the center of this hall was a large cage. "Hello, everyone!" a loud voice boomed through the speakers. A short man wearing a black suit and a plague doctor mask was standing in front of the cage with a microphone in his hands. "Today's fight is the long-awaited match between Blind Bulldog and the Weasel Kid." Loud cheers erupted in the hall, so loud I felt the ground shake. "You have 5 minutes to make your bets before the match starts," Kang Sung whispered to William Kim. "Put $5 million on the Weasel Kid." William nodded obediently and immediately disappeared towards the betting station. Soon 5 minutes passed, and projectors on the ceiling and the walls changed the stone cave and made it appear as we were in a Roman Colosseum. It was so realistic that the artificial sun almost felt real. The audience clapped and howled in anticipation. "Now welcome Blind Bulldog and his master Chai Won-il." Cheers filled the hall as they came out. A rich young man in a velvet Versace tux strutted towards the cave. In his hands was a leash, and attached to that leash was an old man. The only indication that this man was old was due to his long white hair. He wasn't frail, but instead extremely muscular. He crawled on all fours like an animal. There wasn't a scrap of clothing on him. He was naked from head to toe. A large screen allowed me to see him closer in HD. His eyes were cloudy, and he was clearly blind. His body was covered in scars from both bullet and knife wounds. Chapter 23. Lucky Horse 3. Being a former army general, a member of the Special Forces, and at one point a ghost agent, Blind Bulldog has done it all. And when he got into debt, got addicted to drugs, and ended up getting sold to Chai Won-il, his life in this arena began, and he has been the reigning champion for 5 years. The presenter introduced him. But now someone may finally take the champion title from him. It is Weasel Kid and his owner Lu Dong. Cheers, hoots, and feverish screams broke out as Weasel Kid and Lu Dong entered the hall. Just like Blind Bulldog, Weasel Kid was leashed like an animal and completely naked. Lu Dong was an old Chinese man that outwardly looked friendly and charming, but with every step he took he was whipping Weasel Kid's back and pulling at his leash to strangle him. Weasel Kid was scrawny and malnourished, so skinny that you could see his spine jutting out from his back. He was covered in vicious scars and openly bleeding wounds. However, instead of weakness and defeat, there was a craziness in his eyes, something feral and rabid. He was more of an animal than a person. Weasel Kid, a homeless child brought up by Lu Dong to be the most savage and brutal fighter that we have ever had. He's a newcomer, but he has completely dominated the scene these past few weeks, and he has killed all his opponents. Will he make Blind Bulldog his latest victim? Chants and people yelling, "Weasel Kid, Weasel Kid, Weasel Kid," filled the hall. It was obvious who everyone was betting on. As I watched this, I felt Minho's grip on my shoulder become tighter as his hands began to shake. This very place went against his justice. "This is disgusting," I heard him mumble. I smirked slightly. This was only the start. How could he be disgusted at something so tame? Both the fighters got into the cage, and then a loud horn was blown and the fighting commenced. There were no weapons, just two people fighting in hand-to-hand combat, scratch that, two animals fighting hand-to-hand. At first, Blind Bulldog had the advantage. He grabbed Weasel Kid by the waist and smashed him around the cage like he was some rag doll. His weight class gave him an obvious edge. In a matter of minutes, Weasel Kid was bruised and bleeding from being pummeled, and the hall was filled with the satisfying sounds of his bones crunching and breaking upon impact. Any normal person would have given up from this, but Weasel had an intense amount of willpower. He hung on to Bulldog like a snake, clinging to him and refusing to let go no matter how much he was shaken, and then it happened. He bit into his neck. When Weasel Kid opened his mouth, everyone saw his sharp teeth that had been filed to a deadly point. His jaw sunk into his neck and the crunch from his bite echoed into the hall as the crowd turned silent. I felt slight envy as I saw Weasel Kid pull his jaw back and rip out a chunk of bloody flesh from Bulldog. Blood sprayed out into the air like a broken sprinkler. Weasel Kid didn't stop there. He was starving and ravenous. He hungrily gulped and dove back down to bite Bulldog. Of course, Bulldog tried to fight back. His growling became louder. He ran straight into the sides of the cage, even smashing himself against the cutting barbed wire just to shake off Weasel Kid. But nothing worked. No matter how much he flailed or used fancy judo moves, Weasel Kid continued to cling to him, holding on tight as he bit into his flesh and began to eat more and more of him. His cries filled the hall, desperate pleading cries. Soon enough, he was begging to be saved. His tongue appeared to be gone, cut out long ago, but Bulldog clearly shouted the words, "Help me." He shouted this again and again until Weasel Kid started eating his voice box. By that point, Bulldog stopped moving. His blind eyes lost their light. They were filled with that beautiful stillness, a stillness that only comes with death. He fell to his knees and then his body slumped forward. Realizing he was dead, Weasel Kid slowly relinquished his hold, but he didn't stop biting. Soon the only sound we could hear was crunch, 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 crunch. I couldn't look away. It was mesmerizing. I felt some drool build up in my mouth. "Weasel Kid has won," the presenter announced. The crowd was initially silent, but then a few hands clapped, and soon enough the crowd was loudly shouting and clapping their hands. They continued to chant, "Weasel Kid, Weasel Kid, Weasel Kid, Weasel Kid." They continued to cheer, even as workers came into the cage, shot Weasel Kid full of sedatives, restrained him and dragged him off to some unknown location. It makes you hungry, doesn't it? I turned and noticed Sang Min staring at me. The entire time he had been observing my reaction. That starved look in his eyes had only grown. I nodded at his question. I couldn't deny it. I felt like I'd been walking in a desert and had finally glimpsed water. Sang Min smiled at me and said, "I'll show you something good then." He turned to Kang Sung and whispered in his ear. At first Kang Sung seemed annoyed, but then he smiled and nodded approvingly. "Minho, come with me. Sang Min will look after Kang Ho until we leave." Minho didn't respond. It was like his brain had frozen. He was still trying to process the scene that he had just witnessed. "Minho?" When he didn't answer Kang Sung the second time, Chul Su came up to him and slapped him sharply across the face. I'm so sorry, yes, sir." Minho seemed to come to his senses, and he handed me to Sang Min and bowed deeply, his body shaking. He looked like a pathetic lost puppy as he walked off with Kang Sung and the rest. He glanced back at me nervously, but he didn't dare say a word. I almost wanted to go with Minho, but it was probably better to leave him with Kang Sung. He would probably see something shocking with them and have his resolve break faster. Also, I was curious about what Sang Min had in store for me. I hoped it was bloody. Once they were gone, I glanced at Sang Min and gave him my most innocent and charming grin. "So where are you taking me?" "Somewhere you can satiate that appetite." First chapter 24. Lucky Horse 4. Sang Min put my legs around his shoulders and carried me piggyback style. Together we walked through the large, twisting and turning halls. Wherever Sang Min went, people made way for him. He was like Moses parting the Red Sea. This had also happened earlier, but I had assumed that people made space for us because of Kang Sung. Now it was clear that Sang Min was who they truly feared. Which made sense. He ran this place on behalf of not only Kang Sung, but for the Golden Hooves, one of the largest underground criminal organizations in the world. Being the head of this branch meant he was likely a key figure in Golden Hoove. I didn't know how far up the food chain he was, but he had to be pretty high for even Kang Sung to be nervous around him. Kang Sung was friends with the owner of Golden Hoove, so Sang Min had to be someone important. "We're here." I had been so distracted by my thoughts that I didn't notice Sang Min stopping. We had reached a dining area. Unlike the sleek and modern interiors that I had seen so far, this place was more traditionally styled with burning torches around the walls and wooden paneling. It was like we were suddenly inside a classic hutong. There was a long table in front of us made of wood, and there were cushions on the floor. Unlike the other locations we'd been to, this place lacked people. There was only one servant. She stood in the corner with her head bowed. She didn't make a sound, nor even move. A perfectly trained statue. "This is my private space. Only myself and my guests are allowed in here," he told me. Sang Min then gently put me down on a pillow. He took a napkin that was on the table and folded it into a bib, which he neatly fastened around my neck. "I don't want you to get messy now," he said, like a doting uncle. After that, he sat down beside me with perfect posture, with his legs properly folded on the cushion. "Let's play a game called Lucky Horse." "Lucky Horse?" "It's simple," he explained. "There will be 3 horses, and we will have them race against each other. The horse that does the best, or the one we like the most, will get randomly chosen by us. Hence they will be the lucky horse." "And then?" I asked. I felt my heart pounding and that itch growing more intense. "Then," Sang Min gave me a handsome smile, "we'll eat the horse." He clapped his hands, and then the wall in front of us suddenly turned into a transparent glass window. The servant, who hadn't moved an inch before, was now handing Sang Min a remote. She then proceeded to pour him tea into a neat porcelain cup, and she gave me a warm glass of milk. Through the glass window that had opened up before us, I could now see a long chamber, and inside that chamber were 3 people. Each person was dressed like a horse. They had tails attached to their clothes and horse masks on. Sang Min grabbed a mic from the servant's hands and spoke into it. "Hello, horses!" As he spoke, the servant spoke into another mic. She translated his words into what sounded like Arabic. "I'm sure you've been told about today's events, but just to remind you again, this is the Lucky Horse race. All of you have come to South Korea for a new life, but you have been unable to pay us the money you owe us for smuggling you into this country. As a result, you need to pay back this money by entertaining us. Those who perform well will go away with their freedom and their debts paid, and the person who does their best will be chosen as our lucky horse and will be given an extra special prize and privilege." He smiled coldly as he said that. "The rules of the race are simple. Get to the end of the hall and back, that's it." Sang Min put the mic down and then leaned towards my ear and said, "Of course it won't be that simple. We need to make this game fun." He gave me the remote that was filled with interesting buttons and simply grinned at me. The horses talked amongst themselves in Arabic. I couldn't understand them, but they appeared relieved and happy. Perhaps they were encouraging each other. Watching them be so carefree made my body twitch, and I held the controller close to me. A loud horn sounded, and a computerized voice said, "Go." The horses began running at full speed. I watched them race against each other at first. They weren't anything special, but they ran with all their might and seemed hopeful. When they got halfway, I pressed the fire button on the remote. Blue flames shot from the ceiling and engulfed one of the runners. "Ah, ah, 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 ah!" Screams echoed out. It sounded as sweet as a trained choir at the Eisteddfod. Hearing those desperate, high-pitched yells sent me into euphoria. It had been so long since I'd heard someone scream in agony. Maybe because this was the first time I had killed in this lifetime. But his screams reminded me of my first human victim in my past life. Father Johnson. These screams sounded just like his screams. I could easily picture that look of horror and desperation on his face while I poured acid down his throat. Comparatively, this murder wasn't nearly as fun. I'm the type that prefers to be up close and personal with my kills. I'm not a fan of distance, but it was good enough for now. The other horses seemed startled. They screamed in shock. One tried to save the other person who was engulfed in flames, but the other held him back. "Tska." Sang Min appeared to be annoyed and said coldly into the mic, "I never said you could stop." Those words seemed to do the trick, and the two remaining horses pulled themselves together and continued to run. I hummed playfully to myself and then decided on my next button. I pressed it. Arrows came out from the walls and rained onto them. One horse dodged most of them and ran thinking she was free, but then the arrow smacked her in the face and lodged itself through her brain and jaw like a skewer. As her mask fell off and I saw her lopsided and shocked expression, I couldn't help but laugh with joy. When was the last time I'd shot someone with an arrow right through their head? Gosh, it had been a long time. I couldn't stop myself from grinning like a fool. Although this kind of game was childish, I hadn't had this much fun in so long. I wasn't laughing alone. Sang Min also joined me. There was only one horse remaining. He had survived by lying flat on the floor, allowing the arrows to pass him by. He looked at the dead girl and began shaking like a leaf. Yellow piss pooled around him and he sat there in shock. Sang Min was annoyed at this and was about to speak into the mic again, but I stopped him. I stared at him with large, hopeful eyes and I said, "Ah, you see, I want him to be our lucky horse. Can we eat him alive?" Sang Min paused and then stared at me with adoring eyes and gently patted my head. "Of course we can." Chapter 25. Lucky Horse 5. Smoke filled the hall behind the glass. The lucky horse flailed about and ran up to the window and banged on it desperately. Then, as the drug kicked in, he comically slid down and fell to his knees. After the smoke was cleared, the glass window opened up like a sliding automatic door, and the servant wordlessly walked in. She poked the horse with a stick a few times, and then she proceeded to strip him of his clothes. Once they were off, she wrinkled her nose as she smelt the ammonia of his piss from when he had wet himself. She went into the corner, brought out a hose, and cleaned him the same way you'd spray down a car in the summer. She did this for a few minutes, and even threw in some soap and antiseptic into the mix. When his level of cleanliness was finally up to her standard, she then picked him up with ease. She was small, but surprisingly strong. He was then placed on the table in front of us. As she did this, she pressed a button on the side of the dining table that caused metal restraints to pop out. I watched calmly as she skillfully clamped him down, put a ball gag in his mouth, and dabbed some kind of chemical onto her napkin. She held that napkin to his nose, and in a second the horse was awake. He groggily stared at us, and when he realized his situation, he began to panic and struggle. It was like watching a worm squirm about. His shouts were muffled, and his eyes darted all over the place as he tried to look for an exit. "So how do you want to prepare this meal?" Sang Min asked. I looked the horse up and down. He seemed relatively fit. His muscles appeared lean and tough, and there was barely any fat. I pondered for a bit and then made a decision. "I want bulgogi." "Bulgogi, Sang Min grinned and then muttered, "Bulgogi is usually cooked with beef sirloin, which is cross-cut from the front section of the short loin, the same place where the T-bone is cut, so we'll have to slice." He tenderly touched the horse's chest and slid his finger slowly down his front to the back of his leg, from the 12th and last rib and back to the top of the femur where it joins the hip bone. That's the loin, and the rear side of that should be sirloin. As he said this, the horse panicked. His muffled shouts became louder, and his squirming became more forceful, causing the metal restraints to rattle noisily. Of course, he wasn't some superhero. He couldn't break the metal bonds. His struggle was pointless. "You know I've never made bulgogi with horse meat before." Sang-min clapped his hands excitedly. "I wonder how it will taste." As I looked at the terrified horse and I saw that wonderful expression of dread, I felt adrenaline pump through my blood, a rush of energy flooded through me and drool built in my mouth. I couldn't help but swallow loudly. "Yeah, I wonder how it will taste too." Sang-min let out a small laugh and gave me a hug. "You know I never liked children, but now I understand why people reproduce. Even if you reproduce, it's not guaranteed that you'll get a child like me." He nodded. "True, you're special." He continued to pat me fondly. I understood why he was so excited. Being a killer is lonely in a sense. You're a different type of human than those around you, a predator. Humans are social creatures, even killers. We seek to share our lives and experiences with the people around us. But finding someone that understands your carnal nature and shares in your desires isn't easy. It's also especially hard to find your type of killer. I, for one, am a pseudo-sexual sadist and cannibal. I also think of myself as an intellectual killer. I like to plan out my hunts. I get aroused by the torture, the more pain the better. Finding someone like myself is like a needle in a haystack, especially since my kind is the type to never get caught or even suspected. So I understood Sang-min. I was also feeling a strange sense of joy at finding a predator who was so similar to myself. Another monster that would be able to make the games more fun and would make life more convenient for me. And then one day, I'd get to eat him. It had always been a fantasy of mine to devour someone like me, to hear the yells of another predator as they die. What would Sang-min taste like? As I thought this and looked up at Sang-min, I could tell he was thinking the same thing. We simply grinned at each other. The servant wordlessly set up the room for bulgogi. She disappeared for a bit, and then came back with a large grill set. While she was setting it up, Sang-min went to the cupboard at the back of the room and opened it up. There was an array of knives and torture items. It was a cute collection. My old one had been much more extensive. "I think we need to go with exsanguination first. We'll drain him of his blood, then we'll skin him, and then cut out the parts we need. Sound good?" "As long as we try to keep him alive through most of the process. I want to eat him alive." "You're right." Sang-min nodded. He brought out a briefcase filled with all kinds of anesthetics. "We'll need to lessen his pain a bit so he doesn't die from shock straight away, and we need to keep him awake so he can see it all." I nodded enthusiastically, and Sang-min laughed as he prepared a mix of medicines. We chose our tools, and when we turned around, the table had been rotated upside down with the lucky horse's head against the drain. Sang-min gave me the knife and held me in his arms. To exsanguinate someone, you need to slice a large vein, but not an important vein like the pulmonary vein, or else they'll die too quickly. So let's go here. He pointed at the armpits. "Take the first slice." I leaned over, and as I dug the knife through his soft flesh, I felt all this pent-up frustration leave my body like a flood. His muffled shriek sounded like music to my ears. I watched the blood slide down his arm, across his chest and drip from the tip of his head, and I giggled with joy. A few hours later, Sang-min was feeding me soft bulgogi. It melted in my mouth, and with the added spices and soy, it tasted magical. I was glad the meat had become soft and tender while it cooked. Although I had teeth, they were small, and not all of them had grown through properly. This was soft enough to eat with ease. Sang-min grinned with satisfaction. Bulgogi was a wonderful choice. I nodded, but was too busy chewing to say anything. While we ate, the glass wall in front of us had changed its display, and it was now showing CCTV footage of all the rooms in this underground haven. "Oh, look what we have here!" Sang-min chuckled and used a controller to focus on one CCTV feed in particular. It was that arena. "It seems like Kang Seung nominated someone to go fight against those newbies. Wait, isn't that your carer?" I looked up with surprise, but Sang-min wasn't wrong. Sure enough, there was Kang Seung, and next to him a beaten, naked and leashed Minho. The crowd was going wild. It looked like a match was going to start. Interesting. Chapter 26. My Mongrel. 1. In 1961, Lifton published his book Thought, Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, where he defined 8 techniques that are commonly used to reform the way an individual thinks and reasons. Those 8 techniques were milieu control, mystical manipulation, demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine over person, and dispensing of existence. Those techniques were the tip of the iceberg when it came to unfreezing the mind. Unfreezing is the process of disconnecting an individual from their past, manipulating and enhancing their vulnerability to make them susceptible to change. It's a process typically used by cults, religious organizations, and terror groups. It's the first step towards radicalization. When you successfully unfreeze an individual, you can change, or rather warp, that individual's sensibilities. You can make a nice and ordinary man a murdering sexual predator. A good mother will become neglectful. A doting father would become capable of killing his children in cold blood, and so on. I've always been a fan of mind manipulation techniques, especially unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. The mind is a fragile instrument, and it's very interesting in the ways that it can be twisted and turned. If you can play with a mind, then you can essentially create your own slaves who are enamored with you, your doctrine, and your ideals. Manson was good at it, so was Koresh, and more recently Miscavige. I personally was never good at it, maybe because I'm attracted to willful people who like to put up a fight. I did all kinds of things to Melody to attempt to unfreeze her. I locked her away from people, I starved her and tortured her. I showed her kindness and love as well. Yet I never could make her mine in that regard. Of course, I didn't always fail. There had been one time when I succeeded in making someone my follower. It happened during my childhood. There was a girl named Diane who had been raised in the church with me. She had been meek, friendly but quiet, and like many children growing up in our parish, she was a toy of Father Johnson. At first, out of boredom, I ostracized her. I made the other children spread rumors about her seducing the clergyman and praying to devils. With her having to visit Father Johnson's room once or twice a week in the night, it wasn't hard for these rumors to spread. Then I slowly made her rely only on me. I encouraged the other children to bully and assault her. They degraded her, made her cry, treated her like a dog. Every time, just before she passed out, I'd appear to save her. Naturally, she began to revere me like a god. She became a small puppy that hung on my every gesture and sound. It was endearing how loyal she was to me. During her days of abuse, I was her only light, so it was easy for me to put ideas in her head. The first idea was that the world had been overrun by demons and that we were the only humans left. The second idea was that we were put on the world to kill and slay all the demons. I had said all that playfully, but she took every word to heart. In the oncoming weeks, she snuck out at night and left church grounds. Nobody knew what she was up to until the police came and arrested her. Apparently, she had broken into several homes and killed 3 families while they slept in their beds. She also murdered 3 of the church boys who had been bullying her, and their bodies were later found buried in the courtyard. I can still remember the wide smile she had on her face while she was being escorted in cuffs. I felt so proud when she whispered into my ears, "This is only the start. We will get rid of all the demons." Unfortunately, that never did happen. She ended up being sent to a mental institution and dying there at the age of 14 during an electrotherapy session. It was the 50s. Minho reminded me of Diane. However, unlike Diane, he was a grown man with his own ideology firmly set in him. To make him loyal to me, I needed to unfreeze and thoroughly break him first. But a 2-year-old wouldn't be capable of that. That's why I brought him to Golden Hoove. I had intended to push him in this place or have his sensibilities warped in some way. But this was beyond my expectations. Seeing him all beaten and chained up while being escorted to his first match made me feel elated. This would be the start of the extreme conditioning he needed to go through to become my slave. It seemed that leaving him with Kang Seung had been a good decision. "It seems to be him," Sang Min laughed loudly while wrapping his bulgogi in lettuce and placing more meat on the grill. "How entertaining! I wonder what he did to make Seung nominate him. He must have offended him somehow." I didn't say anything. There were various ways in which Minho could have gotten on Kang Sung's bad side. Minho was quite expressive, and he likely displayed his discomfort, or he saw something and protested, or tried to help someone when he shouldn't have helped. Regardless of what he did, it didn't matter. It didn't matter how Minho offended Kang Seung. What mattered was the result. How desperate would these matches make him? In the arena. "It is time for the clash of the newcomers," yelled the short presenter in his Plague Doctor mask. "We've had some exciting first-timers, and now we have a newcomer who's been recommended by Kang Sung himself." The crowd cheered and went wild. The presenter hopped towards Kang Sung. "Sir Kang, please tell us the name of your nominee and what we should expect." He respectfully put the microphone under Kang Sung's chin. Sung made a nasty grin. "His name is Pathetic Bitch." The crowd burst out into laughter, cheers, and hoots. "You should expect nothing except for him to be pummeled. You will see a bloody shit show." "Woo-hoo!" The crowd cheered, and people began laughing at Minho and chanting things like, "Pathetic bitch, die in a ditch, get fucked up." In the torture room, Sang Min cackled while feeding me a tender piece of bulgogi. 6 out of 10 for the rhyme, though the cheer is a bit unoriginal, he said. "You know, a decade ago we used to sell stones to audience members and they'd chuck rocks at the weakest fighter. Now that was fun." "Oh!" I raised an eyebrow. "Why did you stop? That sounds great." "Well, contestants cost money and they usually belong to someone. Stoning someone is amusing, but when they died from the stoning, VIP members weren't happy. This is a business after all, not a cult. People mainly only come here for 3 reasons: to kill, to be entertained, or to make money." I nodded. It made sense, although it was a shame. I could imagine Minho being pummeled by rocks. To be nearly killed by a mob, that sense of uselessness and fear, would make him such a pathetic piece of art. I wanted to see that, but then again, if he died so easily, my plans would be ruined. Chapter 27. My Mongrel 2. Minho couldn't really process his emotions. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. A simple trip with Kang Ho had ended up being a nightmare. On a level, Minho had always had awareness of the corrupt nature of Kang Seung and the Kang family. If the Meng family was the light, then the Kang family was their shadow, entrenched in all manners of shady business. Over the years he had heard all kinds of rumors while working at the Kang estate, from shady deals, murders to adultery. He learnt that injustice was real, that the rich and powerful were able to get away with all kinds of evil. He hated it, but he didn't bother with it. Those rich and powerful people, no matter how much he hated them, were his employers, and he could turn a blind eye to the rumors because they never affected him. Out of mind, out of sight. He arrogantly thought he would never be pulled into their corruption. Yet here he was, surrounded by masked and ravenous strangers. The crowd was jeering at him so loudly that his ears were ringing, and under his palms the concrete ground vibrated. He was exposed, his genitals bare for everyone to see, but he couldn't even feel embarrassed because he was so scared. Pain racked through his limbs from where he'd been whipped and stepped on. His nails had been ripped out from the cuticle, and he had several teeth missing from where he'd been smacked around. A cut above his eye was bleeding profusely, and he could barely see. Between the pain and the fear, he was completely disoriented, and this had all started because of one single comment. A few hours prior, Minho had been walking with Kang Seung and his people. He had been employed long enough to know to keep his mouth shut, but he couldn't help but be concerned about Kang Ho. Such a small child had been given to a strange and dangerous man so casually. He had turned to Kang Seung and said, "Sir, I'm worried about the young master. I don't think it's right for him to be left alone in a place like this." Kang Seung had smiled at his words, but then the next second he had gestured at his bodyguard, and Minho found his legs being kicked in, his face being bashed against the floor, and then after that everything was a painful blur. Before he knew it, he was being escorted out like some animal on a leash. He turned to look back at Kang Seung and began to beg, but he suddenly heard the crack of a whip, and next he felt excruciating pain as it sliced open the flesh on his back. Tears leaked from his eyes, and he peed himself from the shock. "He pissed!" Jeers and laughter echoed throughout the arena. "Dirty animal!" "Disgusting. Pathetic bitch! Pathetic bitch! Pathetic bitch! What began as one voice cheering "pathetic bitch" quickly turned into the whole room mocking him. The awful cheers continued for what felt like an eternity for Minho. He had never felt so demeaned, so pathetic before. He would rather be killed than be in this moment. At that point, 2 shots were fired. The sound of the gun going off made the loud crowd instantly go silent. Now, everyone, I can understand your excitement, but I haven't yet been able to announce Pathetic Bitch's competitor," said the presenter. The small figure in the plague doctor mask casually wiped his smoking gun. "So now presenting our latest challenger, we have another newcomer who has been nominated by Mrs. Lady Lake. Everyone welcome Feral Dog." The crowd broke out into furious cheers as Feral Dog emerged. He was a massive man. He was like the offspring of a man and a giant. He was easily twice Minho's size. He truly was like a dog. His entire body was covered in coarse hair. As he approached the stage, he barked like a rabid mutt as he crawled out proudly on all fours. Behind him was his master, a tall woman who wore a purple dress and a purple mask to obscure her facial features. The presenter ran up to Mrs. Lady Lake and politely handed her the microphone. "What can you tell us about your contestant?" The masked women gently waved at the crowd. "Feral Dog is my mutt. He was abandoned as a child and raised by wild dogs before he was found and put into the trafficking system. I bought him at a slave auction a few months ago, and I have made him loyal to me. But don't be fooled. Just because I've tamed him doesn't mean he's not a beast. He just recognizes his owner." "Thank you for that introduction, Mrs. Lady Lake. Now, before we begin, I'll give you all 5 minutes to place your bets." "Who do you think I should bet on?" "I think Feral Dog looks quite impressive," Sang Min asked. He gave me an expectant look, but I simply shrugged my small shoulders. "Bet on who you want to bet on." "Oh, that's surprising. You must have some hope for your nanny." "Hope?" I smirked. "I just believe in humans more than I believe in animals." I looked at the screen and stared at Minho. A feral mutt is still a mutt, but a human who is pushed to their limits can become a monster. This fight isn't that cut and dry. "What big words?" Sang Min gently patted my head and gestured for his servant. "Put 10 million USD on Pathetic Bitch," he ordered. She wordlessly nodded and silently left the room. "Now for this arena, we bring you to the Sahara." The projectors began to whir, and the arena transformed into a sand-filled desert. Heaters even enhanced the illusion, and the artificial sun was bright and glaring. "We all know the rules. There are no rules. The fight only stops with death or mercy." Feral Dog and Pathetic Bitch were put into the cage. Minho tried to resist, but after another whip from Kang Sung, he obediently entered. The steel doors closed around them with a clang. A loud horn was blown, and then Feral Dog charged at Minho. Chapter 28. My Mongrel 3. The concrete ground was hot. The yelling crowd was loud. The light was bright. Minho couldn't think straight. The world seemed to spin around him. He tried to resist, but then he was struck with the whip again. Clang went the gates as the steel doors closed behind him, and then the next second he was struck hard and flung into the cage walls. The barbed wire bit at his flesh, clawing at his back as he was dragged across it. He cried out as thick, burly fingers held onto his legs and swung him around. He was helpless as he was bashed against the wall again and again. Why me? Why is this happening to me? As he was pushed around, Minho began to reflect on his life. He had always been unlucky. When he was young, his parents got a divorce, and he foolishly decided to stay with his father, while his sister went with his mother. He thought he was better off. But then his dad lost his job and became a raging alcoholic. Minho was often beaten black and blue, and he grew up fearing even the sound of his father's breath. His dad had seemed so big and scary, but when he died, that's when Minho saw how small he really was. A short, stout and sad man with thinning hair and a beer belly. His father was killed in a hit and run. The owner of the car was the 17-year-old son of the chief of police, who had been drunk behind the wheel. Despite it obviously being the fault of the driver, the court was corrupt, the case was twisted, and they blamed the victim for being an alcoholic and running into the road. Of course, Minho knew that wasn't the case. He had seen the incident happen. His dad had been sober for the first time in months. He had waved at him from across the road. The light had turned green, and just as he stepped on the tarmac, that sports car had mowed him down like a blade of grass. But no one listened to Min-ho. The perpetrator got off with a warning. That was the day his hatred for the elite began to fester. In the end, Min-ho dropped out of school to work. He was 18. At the time, he was legally seen as an adult. He could only rely on himself. His life from then on took a downward spiral from one dead-end job to the next. Over the years, no matter how much he saved, he couldn't afford to go to college, and his dream of becoming a pediatrician remained a dream. During the day, he worked as a cleaner, a waiter, and a taxi driver. At night, he was a chauffeur. In all his jobs, he always had to kiss up and deal with all kinds of harassment from the rich and powerful, just to keep his boxed one-room apartment. One day, he met with his sister again. He was sent to clean at the most luxurious mansion in the heart of Seoul, and it belonged to her. He recognized her while he dusted her photos, but she didn't recognize him. The more he cleaned there, the more he learnt about his sister. It turned out that his mother had ended up meeting a wealthy oil tycoon and remarrying. She grew up with all kinds of riches, opportunities, and high-class education. She married her equally rich childhood sweetheart, and she seemed to be in love and living the ideal life. Min-ho had been happy for her initially, but he eventually became bitter. When he saw his half-siblings and his mother at that mansion, all happy and smiling while he mopped their floors, a weight pressed on his throat. Shame, jealousy, anger. It looked like his mother had never spared a thought on him. Bitterness made him bite his tongue, and he never ended up telling them who he really was. Funny enough, from that cleaning job he was referred to the Kang estate. What began as a temporary position became a permanent one. He slowly climbed up the ranks, and after some years he was made a head butler and put in charge of Kang Junki's home. He finally thought he had made it. He was getting paid well, he was saving up money, his job was respectable, and life was finally looking up for him. But now there was this. The situation was ridiculous. As he was yet again swung against the fence, a tired smile broke out on Min-ho's face. At first it was a slight chuckle, but then his laughter grew louder and more hearty with each second. "What did I do to deserve this?" he said in between his hysterical fits of laughter. "Why is my life like this? Always dictated by rich monsters. I'm always trampled on, looked down on, made a fool." Feral Dog grabbed Min-ho's head and smacked it into the ground. He did this continuously, but it didn't stop Min-ho's laughter. The crowd that was originally cheering with excitement died down slightly. There was something very disturbing about the sounds Min-ho made. "Pathetic bitch!" someone loudly yelled. "More like crazy bitch!" As people agreed with this comment, the fight took an unexpected turn. Feral Dog was slamming Min-ho's head into the ground while panting over him. His thick saliva had dribbled onto Min-ho's face, when suddenly Min-ho's hand shot out like a viper. He punched his arm straight through Feral Dog's open mouth and down his throat. Min-ho's laughter hadn't stopped, and he said with a wide smile, "If I'm going to die, I don't want your fucking saliva on my goddamn face." Feral Dog panicked. He clamped his jaw down on Min-ho's arm and bit him desperately. Even though his teeth had sunk into Min-ho's flesh, Min-ho didn't flinch. He seemed to be in a demented daze as he forced his arm further down Feral Dog's throat. Feral Dog punched Min-ho's chest, but it didn't stop him. He forced his arm deeper into Feral Dog's mouth until he was stuck up to his shoulder. By that point, Feral Dog was very much dead. His jaw hung wide open and slack. Blood seeped out from the corners of his mouth as his wet tongue loosely lay there. Despite him being dead, Min-ho continued to reach deeper and deeper into his body until he pulled something out. It was Feral Dog's large intestine. As the organ flopped about and was pulled from the body, Min-ho didn't stop laughing. The audience had stopped. Sounds of nervous gulps could be heard and a few gags, but otherwise it was silent. As Min-ho deliriously looked at the intestine in his bloody hand, he stared at the crowd and waved at them. He then pranced across the stage, dancing, and through his giggles he yelled, "Are you not entertained?" He laughed a bit more, and then tears began to fall from his face. "Oh God!" he screamed. He dropped the intestine and then slumped to the ground before passing out. "Holy shit!" sang Min clapped. I simply smiled. I hadn't been wrong. There was a monster in Minho, a monster that I was going to raise carefully. Felicie, Chapter 29. My Mongrel and Four. That was quite the show, Sang Min announced as he walked up to Kang Sung. I can tell you weren't expecting it. Kang Sung ignored his words and instead looked at me. I was being held preciously in Sang Min's arms while he gently fed me milk from a warm bottle. It seems you're quite fond of my grandson. I think I'm more than fond. Sang Min smiled brightly and leaned towards Xiong's ear. If I had my way, I'd make him my grandson, he whispered. Ha! Kang Sung sniggered and whispered back. I'd like to see you try. You know, if I really wanted to, I could have you killed right here and just take him. Kang Sung shrugged. True, but I don't think you'd be able to handle the consequences. I might risk it all for this little treasure. You like him that much? I do. Well, that's not good. Kang Sung pried Sang Min's hands off me and took me into his arms. I need an heir, Sang Min. Find some other person to thirst for. I don't want to eat him, Sang Min pouted. Kang Sung glared at him. Okay, I admit I do want to play with him a bit, but generally I want to train him. Train him in what, murder? Kang Sung scoffed. Anyone can learn to kill. He doesn't need to be taught that. He has bigger things to achieve in the future. Sang Min's eyes hardened, and the playful light in them faded. I'm being serious. I hope you realize that. I'm also being serious. The two silently faced off like beasts marking their territory. Interestingly enough, Kang Sung was the one who gave in. In the future, if he's curious and remembers you, I'll allow him to come play with you, but for now leave him alone. Sang Min gave a satisfied grin. I'm fine with that. He leaned over to me and winked. You better remember to visit this uncle in the future or I'll be very upset. In response, I simply patted his cheek with my small hand and nodded. Or, can I adopt him? Please, sir. No. His dad's not in the picture, right? Just accept me as your son, and I'll take him as my child. Sang Min whined. Kang Sung rolled his eyes. And why on earth would I do that? I already have one useless son. I don't need two. Useless. Me. As the two bickered, I watched their back and forth with some amusement. Surprisingly, they seemed to be good friends. At that moment, Sang Min's phone rang. He made an interesting face the moment he saw the caller ID. Well, it seems that duty calls. Let's catch up another time, sir. He bowed politely to Kang Sung. Goodbye, young master. Uncle will miss you. He hurriedly pecked me on the forehead and then disappeared into the long stretch of corridors behind us. I simply waved as he left. Kang Sung groaned. He always gives me a headache. Is that so, sir? Kang Sung's secretary, William Kim, appeared from behind and offered him a glass of water. I thought you were quite fond of Sang Min. Kang Sung smirked. He's the son I wish I had. That's why he gives me a headache. He then turned to me. Did you have a good time, Ho? I couldn't hide my joy even if I wanted to. A wide smile spread over my face and I nodded. Good. I'm glad you had fun. He patted my head gently and gave me a soft grin. As he did this, I tilted my head to the side and gave him a curious look. I think you had more fun than me. You took my pet and used him. Hearing my words, Kang Sung's eyes widened, and then he burst into laughter. Your old granddad really did play with your toy. Will you forgive me? I pouted and pretended to think about it before staring up at Kang Sung and saying cutely, I might just forgive you if you let me see him. Kang Sung's eyes twinkled. Since I must get your forgiveness, let's go and see that mongrel. Yay! We walked down the corridor to a steel door. Kang Sung's bodyguard opened it for us, and I was greeted by an interesting sight. It was a jail. There were numerous people in this large room, all kept in separate pens. They all wore leashes and were hooked to the walls. They had feeding stations and bowls like animals in front of them, and name tags on their collars stating their owners. As we walked further down, we came to a medical ward. A woman wearing a face mask with her hair tied in a neat little bun was tending to Min Ho's wounds. She seemed to be in her own world as she stitched the gashes on his back. She didn't notice us until William politely coughed to gain her attention. The moment she saw Kang Sung, she panicked and bowed rapidly. Do what? Hello, sir. How may I help you? That dog belongs to my grandson, and he wanted to see him, nothing more. You can continue with your business. She bowed even deeper and then awkwardly went back to her stitching. Do you want me to wake him up? Kang Sung asked. I shook my head. I just wanted a look. After he's cleaned up, I'll return him to you. No, keep him here. Kang Sung raised a surprised eyebrow. He did well in his fight, so he should have more matches. I'll come to visit him before and after every match, and I'll take him back when he's ready. Ready? I simply smiled at Kang Seung, and then I uncontrollably yawned. I was still in a child's body after all. No matter how much I tried to resist sleep, this growing shell demanded rest. It has been a long day, hasn't it? Let's go back, Kang Sung said as he noticed my head fall. I didn't even have the energy to respond. My eyes felt heavy, and then I fell asleep. When I next woke up, I was back at the Kang estate, staring at the familiar ceiling of my nursery. I stretched slowly. As I moved my small limbs, a new face popped up above my cot. She seemed to be a maid. She was young and pretty, with large, deer-like eyes and a small, oval-shaped face and full lips. She looked like a doll I wanted to pull apart. You're awake, young master. She smiled innocently and gently picked me up. I'll be your nanny while Min Ho is on leave. She tickled my chin and smiled happily. It seems like you had a good dream. You must have enjoyed your day out with Master Shung a lot. I nodded. I had enjoyed it very much. Day is Chapter 30. My Mongrel. 5. The new maid, or rather the substitute nanny, was named Han Hye-kyo. She was innocent to the point of it being ridiculous. No matter what I said to her, even if it was a twisted joke, she never seemed to understand. She laughed idiotically at everything and petted me like I was some doll. Other than her looks, I found her to be an incredibly boring individual. She gossiped about celebrities all day with the other staff. She read me the same fairy tales again and again, and her singing, let's just say her lullabies, were so out of key they gave even me nightmares. While she still took me on my morning walks around the estate, she wasn't much for stimulating conversation. And she never told me about any news that mattered. To summarize all of this, I simply missed Min Ho. I had taken for granted what a convenient minion I had. If I were to compare Hye-kyo to Min Ho, it was like comparing cheap convenience store wine to Dom Perignon. But I had to be patient. Even though I wanted Min Ho, I had to wait for him to taste better. Like wine, Min Ho gets better with time. Once a week on a Friday, Kang Sung would take me back to Golden Hoof to watch one of Min Ho's matches. Each match, Min Ho became more and more vicious. The desperation, combined with his sleep deprivation and torture, was quickly bringing out the monster in him. Watchers in the arena had long stopped calling him pathetic bitch. Now he was known to everyone as the laughing confector. The more desperate he was in a match, the more maniacal he would become. His laughter would be frantic and joyful. He would ignore all the pain as he did the most beautiful things to his victims. Annoyingly, though, at the end of each fight his morality would kick in, and he'd always scream before fainting. I wished he would truly grow into his carnivorous nature. I hated the way he rejected it, but there was still time. He was still growing. After his matches, I would visit him. I had requested for Kang Sung to isolate Min Ho more than the other animals. As a result, Min Ho had his own cell. He was given one meal a day made of breadcrumbs and water. There was no toilet, so he had to sit in his own filth without a shower. Bugs crawled on him and flies came flying towards his stench. By this point I had kept him in that hell for 4 months. He was now a shell of his former self. His hair was long and dishevelled. He was so skinny that his bones could be seen through his skin, but unlike before, there was a devilish glint in his eyes. A demon had taken over his body and was watching me through him. This is the stage that you would call unfreezing. I had deprived Min Ho of his sense of self, sensibilities and morals. It was in this state that he was susceptible to change, or rather my mind control would easily take effect. Every time I visited Min Ho after his match, I would be his light, his shine, his happiness and hope. I came with tears in my eyes. Minho, are you okay? You look awful," I wailed. I then gave him bread. I snuck out some food again, and I'm talking to Grandad. He said he'll let you out soon. He promised. Minho grabbed my hand and ate the bread from it like some mutt. Watching him lick up my palms, trying to get every scrap so desperately, brought a smile on my face that I struggled to hide. He reached out a weak palm to my face and gently squeezed my cheek. "You're a good child," he said with a hoarse and dry voice. "Too good for these people and this world." I held Minho's hand. It felt frail, so frail that I could probably break his fingers with my infantile strength. "Minho, there are so many scary people in the world. I need you to protect me. I'm scared." Minho's hands trembled and he shook his head. "I don't know if I'll survive this place." "You will survive this place. I will help you survive. You're the only person I can rely on, and I'm the only person you can rely on. We need to protect each other. You need to protect me." I said this to Minho every time I saw him. It was a layman's attempt at brainwashing. It was basic but effective. I just kept reinforcing the message that the only person he could rely on was me, and that he had to protect me. I was his whole world and his only source of kindness. Admittedly, this type of brainwashing would be harder on someone who was more strong-willed, but for Minho, it worked. He was already unstable and had unorthodox ideas, and he was now thoroughly unstabilized by his current torture, making him more vulnerable and easy to convince. "Yes, I'll do my best to protect you. You're all I have," he whispered to me. "I promise if I get out of here, I'll do everything for you, Kang Ho. We'll look after each other." I nodded and cried. Thick, big tears slid down my cheeks easily, and then I said, "Uncle Minho, I know how to get out of here. I heard Grandad saying how they'd let you out. Tell me, please." Minho held onto my shoulders with shaking hands. I could smell the desperation coming off of him, stronger than the stench of urine. I leaned towards his ears and said, "You need to throw away those useless morals. Every time you scream at the end of your matches, you end up staying longer. You need to enjoy the kill. Let yourself go. Once you do that, Grandad will let you out." Minho stared at me with soulless eyes and remained silent for a while. I almost thought he saw through me and my entire act, but he nodded. "I have to give in." A twisted smile cracked out at the corner of his lips. "Is that it?" The bloodthirsty look in his eyes sent shivers down my spine. I felt like he would devour me with his gaze alone. It seemed like he was ready. "That's it. Once you do that, you'll be free to protect me." Minho squeezed my hand. "Don't worry, little one. I'll be by your side soon, and I'll protect you forever. There's nothing I won't do for you. I'll keep you safe from these vermin. I'll make sure this never happens to you. I'll do everything for you." That's what I wanted to hear. And just like that, in the next match, when he pulled out Weasel Kid's spine while he was still breathing. As the blood splattered on the nearby audience and his horrifying screams echoed out, Minho never stopped laughing, not even as he was dragged off the stage. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. When he left that place, he loyally held my hand and listened to my every word. He had truly become my mongrel. 6 years later,